Well, welcome everyone. It's always good to have a discussion, especially well, in South Africa, it's on a Wednesday morning, about 10 o'clock, and it is cold, but not that cold like everywhere else in the world, seemingly. African weather and African winter is very different. But in this discussion, obviously, it's also good to have two friends joining us and two friends being together, having a conversation. This is the first debate between Samuel Green and my friend Bashir Vania, and they're both friends. And it's a wonderful opportunity to bring them together and to look at just the context of what should be discussed amongst Christians. And again, they are two gentlemen. And with that being said, it's always wonderful to have two gentlemen coming together and discuss a central topic. When you look at the topics that are being discussed today, a lot of people have attempted to discuss the topic with great success. And the concept or just the understanding of what Muslims believe, obviously Bashir will look at. And we're looking at the topic, was Jesus crucified, which is very central to Christianity and also central to our faith and belief. And it is wonderful to think that, we've got Muslims that are willing to discuss the topic. We've got Christians that are willing to defend it. And this is what we want to do today, is we want to give ample opportunity for both sides to be reflected. And we want to make sure that the world can see that Christians and Muslims can get along and they can have a good discussion, robust discussion around these issues. And they can do so with great decency and respect towards each other. So with that being said, the two speakers that are available today, Bashir Vania. Bashir, I've probably known you now for 10 years, I think. And then also a new friend of mine, Samuel Green. If you're looking for any more information, Bashir mentioned just beforehand, he's got a website called islamicinfo.co.za. And there you can find articles, you can find YouTube debates, you can find books, you can find forthcoming events and some latest news that is available. And then for Samuel, there is a website that he has, which is called Engaging with Islam. That's one word, .org. And so if you want to contact, if you want to get more information, if you want to see what each author has written, obviously you can go to those different platforms and you can have a look at that. So with that being said, let me just give you a short outline as to what the debate format will look like. Again, we've got very seasoned debaters, so for me, it makes my task a lot easier. But Samuel is going to go first, and he's going to have a 20-minute opening, and that will be followed by Bashir. And then after that, we're going to have a 10-minute rebuttal from each side. And then we're going to have a 10-minute cross-examination where the debatants, where they are going to ask each other questions. And then there's going to be a 3-minute closing from each participant, with Bashir going first and Samuel last. But that is the straightforward way in which we will conduct this conversation. So that being said, without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Samuel, and as soon as he's cued his presentation and as soon as he starts to speak, I will start the clock for his first introduction and his first 20 minutes. Over to you, Samuel.
Thank you, Rudolph. And I do want to thank you, Rudolph, for helping to organise this, and Bashir for being part of this as well. I appreciate this opportunity. And I really hope that for those of us who are watching this video, whether you're a Christian or a Muslim, that today will be a helpful discussion for you, and you'll get to see both sides of the question and how it's answered. The question before us tonight is, was Jesus crucified? Now, for Christians, Jews, and historians, around the year 33 AD, Jesus of Nazareth was executed by crucifixion by Roman soldiers in the city of Jerusalem. Muslims generally have a different view, and that is that Jesus wasn't crucified and died. And this is because of what the Qur'an says, that Jesus only appeared to die. And that's the question for us tonight. Now, I'm going to switch over to my slideshow. No, hang on, I better do this first. Share screen. Share from the beginning. Okay, hopefully you can see that. Is that okay, Rudolph? Yep, okay. So this is my structure for tonight. I want to look at the crucifixion in the Quran and its interpretation. And I'm going to do that because This is really where the disagreement comes from, and also because the Quran invites Christians to read it. And then I'll look at the witness of the gospel and history outside of the Bible. So let's get straight into it. Here are the verses. They said, "We killed Christ Jesus, the son of Mary, the apostle of God, but they killed him not, nor crucified him. But so it was made to appear to them. And those who differ about this are full of doubts with no certain knowledge, but only assumption to follow. For of certainty they killed him not. Rather, God raised him to himself." Now, when it comes to understanding these verses, there is no hadith from Muhammad explaining them. And Muslims have come up with about 9 different interpretations. And I'm just going to go through these very quickly now. The first is that somebody was substituted for Jesus. The substitution theory is that there was a crucifixion, but it appeared to be Jesus, but it was in fact someone else. This idea, I've been told, originates with St. John of Damascus, but it's become the classical explanation of Islam in the classical commentaries. Although I've noticed that most modern apologists that I've debated have mentioned it. And probably this is because there's no reference to a substitute in the verses itself. The other one is that no one was crucified, but it was a vision. Now, no one was crucified, but the whole event was in some type of vision, a communal vision. Allah does give visions in the Quran, but I guess why I don't find this convincing is that the Jews are saying they did it, not just that they saw it. The next is that no one was crucified, and the whole thing is a myth. This is a new one from Ijaz Ahmed, and it's that the New Testament authors made it appear so through developing their tradition and generating a myth over the early centuries of Christianity. I want to say, though, that the Quran does not say that the Jews learned this from the Christians. And we have very good evidence for the gospel tradition for the death of Jesus going right back to the 30s. So there's no evidence for a development of tradition. There's also the idea that Jesus was crucified. And there's actually 5 views of this, that Jesus was crucified, but it was the Romans who crucified Jesus, not the Jews. Because you'll notice that the verses don't say that Jesus was never crucified or Jesus did not die. It says that the Jews did not kill or crucify Jesus. And that's a slightly different thing. And so some people have said that it's the Romans who did it, not the Jews. Another view is that Jesus' soul was taken away before he was killed. This is based on the Quran's teaching that God takes our souls at death and also when we're asleep. In Islam, it's called sleep is called the lesser death. And so Jesus appeared to be crucified and killed, but his soul was gone. And so it was just an empty body that was there. Another is from Dr. Ali Attai, and that is that Jesus was crucified, but the Quran is refuting the Talmud. In the Talmud, the rabbis had constructed an alternative crucifixion account in which they stoned and crucified Jesus and accused Mary of immorality. And he says that the Quran is denying this narrative, not the Christian narrative in the Gospels. The other one is that Jesus was crucified but survived. This is by Shabir Ali and the Ahmadiyyan part of Islam. I don't find that convincing just because it just doesn't seem to be what it's talking about there. And then the final one for Jesus actually dying is that Jesus was a martyr, and that the Quran denies the death of Jesus in the same way it denies the death of any martyr. And that's from Cyril Glacy in his Encyclopedia of Islam. The final view we'll look at is from Sayyid Qutb and Madudi, 2 significant commentators, and they say that they don't know what happened. Let me just read out to you what they say, because I can't read it on the screen at the moment. That they say, Madudi says, the Quran explicitly states that the Jews did not succeed in putting Jesus to death and that Allah raised him to himself, but it is silent about the nature and details of the matter and does neither say explicitly whether Allah raised him body and soul together from the earth to some place in heaven, nor that he died like other mortals and only his soul was raised to heaven. Therefore, on the basis of the Quran, neither aspect can be definitely denied or affirmed. Now, the strength of this position is that it's just trying to stick with the verses as they come in the Quran. Now, as we can see, that I've just outlined quickly 9 different explanations there. And I guess I've got a question for people tonight. if you are a Muslim, which position do you hold and why? And from Bashir, can you please give us your explanation, your understanding of what's happening? But I think it's easy to see, though, that there's no consensus among Muslim scholars as to what the verses mean. And it's a little ironic here because often Christians are told that we have only conjecture and contradiction to follow, whereas I would argue that for Christians, we all agree Jesus died and was raised again, whereas it seems that the Muslims are the ones who aren't sure what it means, and they're the ones with the conjecture. We'll move on. What do the verses actually mean? I want to suggest that the verses are actually describing the death of Jesus in terms of a martyr. If we just look at them again, they say, they said in boast, we killed Christ Jesus, the son of Mary, the apostle of God. But they killed him not, nor crucified him, but so it was made to appear to them. And those who differ about this are full of doubts, with no knowledge, but only assumption to follow. For of certainty they killed him not. Rather, God raised him to himself. Now, what is it that the verses say? Well, they're saying that those people who boast of killing and crucifying Jesus are told that they did not. But it did appear that they did. And those who disagree about this have no certain knowledge. No, God raised Jesus to himself. And what I'd like to do now is to look at each of these four ideas and see how the rest of the Qur'an explains them, to let the Qur'an explain itself. Because when you read the books on tafsir, they all say that the Qur'an is the first interpreter of itself. And so I want to begin with the Qur'an interpreting itself. I'm just going to try to get this out of the way here. I can't do that. No, let's go back. Okay, well, according to the Qur'an, what does it mean to boast of killing someone and then to be told that you did not? Well, it's got to do with the Qur'an's understanding of the doctrine of life and death. You see, the Qur'an doesn't really have a medical understanding of death. Have a listen to how it describes life and death. It says, God takes the souls at the time of their death, and he takes in their sleep those who have not died. And so this is this idea in Islam, in the Qur'an, that when you sleep, Allah takes your soul. And so there's the greater death, which is the end of life, but then there's the lesser death. And so your soul can be taken without you dying, in a sense. We see that this is also, we see that the Qur'an says that Allah is the only one who gives life. So it is we who give life and cause death, and to us is the journeying. And so because only God can give life and only God can give death, and the Qur'an has its own understanding of death, we see that when people boast of killing people, they're told they didn't. So look at verse 8, chapter 8, verse 17. This is where Muhammad's soldiers were boasting about having killed Muhammad's enemies. And have a look at what Allah says to them. He says, you did not kill them, God killed them. Now, historically, those soldiers did absolutely kill Muhammad's enemies. There's no doubt about it. But God says to them, you did not kill them. God did. And so this is what we see in the Qur'an's description of Jesus, that only God can take life. Only God can take life. Now, according to the Qur'an, what does it mean that someone only appears to die when they did not? What does it mean in the Qur'an that someone only appears to die when they did not? Well, we find that this is how the Qur'an describes the martyrs. So have a look there. Do not say of those who were killed in the way of God dead. No, they are living, but you do not perceive that. You see how you don't see it. It doesn't appear that the martyrs are alive. It appears that they're dead, but they're actually living. And so you're not to say that they're dead. When you see a martyr, you're meant to say they're alive. Now, this is exactly what we see in the Qur'an's description of the crucifixion. I won't go look at that one just now. I won't have time. Now, what does it mean when the Qur'an says that those who disagree have no certain knowledge? Well, this has to do with what the Qur'an sees about itself, because the Qur'an sees itself as the true source of knowledge, because it tells you what is seen and what is unseen. And so you see there, Allah is the knower of the unseen and the witnessed, the grand and the exalted. And so this is what we have. This is what the Qur'an's telling us, The Quran is telling us the unseen things that were happening at the death of Jesus. It appeared to be one way, but Allah in the Quran is telling you the unseen. He's telling you what you did, what you couldn't know just by yourself. And finally, what does it mean when the Quran says that God raised Jesus to himself? Well, this is what happens to all martyrs. Chapter 3, verse 169. Do not reckon those who are killed in God's way as dead. No, they are alive with their Lord. You see, martyrs are taken to God. That is the unseen reality. They're not taken bodily, and these verses in the Quran never say that Jesus was taken bodily up. It just says he was taken. And martyrs, we know, go to be in paradise in the Quran, to be with God. And again, this is what we see when the Quran is describing the crucifixion. It's describing it in terms of Jesus being a martyr. Therefore, when the Quran is describing the crucifixion, it is the description of the death of a martyr. It is describing the unseen reality that God reveals in the Quran. I'll now move on to the testimony of the gospel. And I don't need to spend much time on this because the gospel is really clear that Jesus died on the cross. Jesus spoke about his death on many occasions. We'll just read a few of these now. From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the hands of the elders, chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. Or in Matthew 20, verse 28, the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. And so all of the gospel accounts record the death of Jesus on the cross. So he's just one of them from Mark, but they all have an equivalent. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. There they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it, and they crucified him. Now, the disciples of Jesus speak about his death. So we'll look at the Apostle Peter. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. According to his great mercy, he has caused us to be born again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. Or the Apostle Paul, for while we were still weak, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. Now, you can see here that the Bible is very clear on these things. Sometimes people say that the Bible isn't clear and that it was, and so I've got some examples here. In Ahmed Deedat, in his book Crucifixion on page 55, said that there were no witnesses to the crucifixion. Yet if you actually read the verses he refers to, there are witnesses there. And then also we see that in Luke and John, where the disciples and his mother are specifically said to be right at the cross. Sometimes Hebrews chapter 5 verse 7 is put forward, but Hebrews actually explicitly says that Jesus died in chapter 2 verse 14, 9, 15, 13 and 20. God did save Jesus from death. It's called the resurrection, and the resurrection is when we're all saved from death. Now I'll move on to historians. When it comes to history, we've actually got quite a number of historians from outside of the Bible who make reference to the death of Jesus as being the message that Christians were saying. And so historians say that the crucifixion of Jesus is beyond reasonable doubt. Let me just read to you a few of these. So this is one of these early references to the death of Jesus from Tacitus at the beginning of the 2nd century. He says, Christus, the founder of the name Christians, had undergone the death penalty in the reign of Emperor Tiberius by the sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate. And so all historians accept that Jesus died on the cross. It's beyond a reasonable doubt. That's how they speak about it. I'll just refer to E.P. Sanders, who's not a Christian and sort of represents the general historical consensus. Jesus was executed on the orders of the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate. I've even found some Islamic historians, conservative ones, Professor Masoud al-Hassan, in his History of Islam. He writes that Jesus, was betrayed by the Jews and crucified, and that Allah lifted him to the heavens. And so the conclusion I want to make from this section is just that historians fully accept the crucifixion of Jesus. Now, let me just, I can stop that share now. And so historians fully accept the crucifixion and the death of Jesus as beyond reasonable doubt. And there are no historians saying that it's something that's doubtful. So I'm going to conclude now. The question tonight was Jesus crucified? And I want to say to this, the answer is yes, and there is no reason at all to doubt this. As we have seen, the Qur'an's description of the crucifixion is best understood as that of a martyr if we let the Qur'an interpret itself. It's a description of the unseen realities that the Qur'an claims to make known. It's not a denial of the historical facts. And we saw how on other occasions when people had killed people, when Muhammad's enemies had killed people, they were told, you have not killed them, even though it appeared that they did. And so the Qur'an's description is best understood as that of describing a martyr. It's a theological description, not a historical description. We have seen that the gospel is clear, that Jesus was crucified and killed, and that this is the universal message throughout the gospel and the New Testament. We've also seen that ancient and modern historians all accepted this, and that there are even some Islamic historians who accept it as well. I want to put forward that this is actually an area in which Christians and Muslims should agree. We have some areas in which we definitely do disagree, and I think it's important that we acknowledge those disagreements. But this is a place that I actually think we can make some progress and at least agree that Jesus was on the cross. We may disagree as to why he was on the cross. For Christians, it's Jesus dying for our sins to make atonement for us. For Muslims, I would argue it's a description of the ideal martyr. But we can at least agree that he was on the cross. So thank you for your patience and for your attention, and I'll finish there.
Well, you've got 2 minutes to spare, but
no,
if
I'm fine.
You can't.
That's my presentation.
Excellent. That's wonderful. Okay, over to Bashir. Bashir, I'm going to ask you just to put on your video, and you can activate your video. I'll ask you. And Bashir, then you have 20 minutes to do your opening presentation. And I'm going to mute Samuel. As soon as you start speaking, Bashir, I will start your 20 minutes. You're still unmuted. You're still unmuted, Bashir. Lovely, if you can just ask her.
Can you hear me now?
That's perfect.
Okay, great. All right, can I start? Okay. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. I begin in the name of God, most gracious, most merciful. Mr. Chairman, fellow travelers. I believe that most of you will be aware that for Christians, as my brother Samuel pointed out, the crucifixion of Jesus is probably the most important event, both historically as well as theologically. However, many Christians are either astonished or offended that the Quran dismisses this event with just one verse, chapter 4, verse 157. I'll read it again very briefly. And the people mocked, and they said that we killed Christ Jesus, the apostle of God, but according to the Arabic, وَمَا قَتَلُوهُ وَمَا صَلَبُوهُ, they did not kill him, nor did they crucify him, وَلَكِنْ شُبِّهَ لَهُمْ, but so it was made to appear to them. And the Quran concludes this verse by saying that the people who talk about this event are perhaps indulging in lots of guesswork. So just to clarify the points, and I think the listener has to be very clear here, that as a Muslim, my mandate is only to prove that they did not kill Jesus in any manner, nor crucify him. Now, please note that the Quran does not say or talk about the substitution theory, okay? That somebody was placed on the cross instead of Jesus. Although that is not an impossibility, according to Christianity, Matthew chapter 17, verse 10, there is the transfiguration. Jesus somehow had this ability to change his form, so it is quite possible. The swooning theory is also another theory. Again, not impossible, that Jesus was on the cross and somehow he was brought down from the cross and he revived himself. He revived Lazarus. Why couldn't he revive himself? The martyrdom theory, I think my brother Samuel brought it up. But, you know, again, it's an allegory. Let us stick to the historical details rather. So, in essence, what we have is two opposing worldviews on one incident. What is to be done? Well, the Quran has a solution. Chapter 10, verse 94, the Quran says, if thou, O reader, were in doubt as to what we have revealed unto thee, then ask those who have been reading the book before you. So, if it is a scientific statement, you ask the scientist and you fine-tune your thinking. Biological statement, you ask the biologist. This is a historical statement, so you go to historians. We evaluate what is written. We know that the earliest account of the crucifixion is the Gospels, so we read it, we evaluate it, we weigh the evidence, and then we consider our verdict. And what we do here really is we cross-question the witnesses of the opposite party, and we try and prove our case this way. This isn't an odd thing, as the Quran suggests. Every court of law in the world does this. So let us put the witnesses in the witness box, and we will begin with the witness Matthew. According to Matthew chapter 27, verse 28, we are told that the Romans stripped Jesus and they put on a brilliant red robe. Scarlet is the word. That's in 27, 28, Matthew. The witness John says, no, hold on. John 19, verse 2. They put on a purple robe for him. Which witness do I believe? Mark 15:21 tells us that Simon of Cyrene carried the cross for Jesus. But the witness John says, hold on, John 19:17, Jesus carried his own cross on the day of his crucifixion. Again, who do I believe? Mark 15:25 tells us that Jesus was crucified on the third hour. John 19:14, no, it was around the 6th hour. Matthew 27 verse 3 tells us that Judas, the betrayer of Jesus, he died by hanging himself. He committed suicide. Acts 1 verse 18 says, no, hold on. He died in a farming incident which ruptured his stomach. Which witness do I believe? Now, let us discuss the place of crucifixion. Mark 15 verse 22 tells us that Jesus was brought to Golgotha, the place of skulls. I think all the Gospels are vaguely agree on that. And this is generally identified with the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It was identified by Helen, the wife of the Emperor Constantine. And that's fine. However, here is the problem. This place is located within the walls of Jerusalem. June issue of Public Archaeology Review 2020 confirms this. And they also confirm that there is a grave problem here. Because John 19 verse 20 tells us that the crucifixion took place near the city. In other words, not inside the city of Jerusalem, near the city. Hebrews 13 verse 12 confirms this. It says that the crucifixion took place outside the gates of the city. So even as we speak, the exact location of the crucifixion is being debated, hotly debated, revised. And folks, you know you have a problem when you don't know when the most important event in the universe since the creation of the universe took place. So, real problem. Let us talk a little bit about the witnesses to the actual crucifixion. Mark 14 verse 50 tells us that they all forsook him and fled. In other words, all the disciples forsook Jesus and they fled. Mark 15 verse 40 also confirms that some of the disciples, all ladies, watched from afar. Mark 15 verse 40. Matthew 27 verse 55 agrees. Says they watched from a distance. However, John 19 verse 26 tells us, no, hold on. The ladies were standing right at the cross, so close that they could actually communicate with Jesus. And Jesus could tell them, he could insult his mother at that point. Woman, behold your son, his mother. And interestingly enough, the disciple whom Jesus loved, a male, was also there, which is a stark contradiction. So, were they right close by to the crucifixion? Were they standing from afar? We don't know. Understand this. Jesus was crucified as an enemy of the state. So historians are quite mystified as to why Pontius Pilate would give the body to somebody outside the family of Jesus, namely Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy man. And since Jesus was the enemy of the state, I can understand why all the disciples forsook and fled, guilt by association, as the Palestinians there in Israel, what is happening to them. And here comes Joseph of Arimathea, bold as you please, asking for the body of Jesus. This can only take place if perhaps there was some agreement between Pontius Pilate and Joseph of Arimathea. And when Joseph asks for the body, he uses the word soma in the Greek, which could mean a dead or a living. It is ambiguous, a dead body or a living body. But he doesn't use the word nikros or patoma, which means a corpse, which I find quite interesting. So here we have it. Now, we have seen that there are problems here. So let us now question Jesus, the most important witness. And Jesus, in Matthew chapter 12, verse 39, he makes a prophecy. And he says, no sign will I give the people except the sign of Jonah. So I understand Christians have 1,001 prophecies in the Bible. Jesus says, forget about all those. Nonsense. I'm going to give you one prophecy. Only one. He puts all his eggs in one basket. And what is that? The sign of Jonah. And he says, for as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the whale, so will I be 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the earth. It's quite simple. How was Jonah in the belly of the whale? Was he dead or alive? We know he was alive. He he was praying. So how was Jesus in the belly of the earth, dead or alive? In order for him to fulfill this prophecy, he had to be alive 3 days and 3 nights. Further, in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 45, we are told that when we die as physical bodies, but when we are resurrected as spiritual bodies. I think everybody intuitively accepts this, And when we are resurrected as spiritual bodies, these spiritual bodies are called pneuma, spiritual bodies. Now, in Luke 24, verse 37, after the crucifixion, the disciples had heard what happened and they're having a meeting and they're all upset, and in walks Jesus. And of course, naturally, the disciples are startled and they are frightened. They assumed, as Luke says, they were seeing a pneuma, a spirit, of course. Jesus died. He's resurrected. But this is what Jesus has to say. He says, why are you frightened? It is I myself. Handle me and see, for a pneuma, a spirit, has no flesh and bones as I have. And in order to prove it, he took a piece of fish and he ate it. So what is so significant about this? Firstly, Jesus, when you die, you resurrect as a pneuma. Jesus says, I am not a pneuma, which means he didn't die. If he didn't die, it means he was not resurrected. If he was not resurrected, it means they did not kill him, nor did they crucify him, as the Quran stipulates. So Jesus, the chief witness in this whole affair, is making it quite clear that he was not killed nor crucified. Okay, so just to make up my brief summation, we see there are problems with all the witnesses, purple robe, scarlet robe, 3rd hour, 6th hour, so forth. We see that our main witness, Jesus, peace be upon him, he gives us a prophecy of Jonah. And then in order to strengthen that prophecy, he tells his disciples that, look, I am not a pneuma, I'm flesh and blood and bone, just like you are, and he eats for them, and so forth. And in conclusion, look, we are told that when Jesus, peace be upon him, when he was on the cross, he cries out. He says, Allah, Allah, lama sabaqtani, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? He cries out to Allah, why have you forsaken me? And that's Matthew 27, verse 46. Now, where did that call come from? Psalms 22, verse 5. Now, this was the last words of Jesus. And we want to know why he quoted Psalms 22, verse 5. So I checked. I went, and it's quite interesting. Psalms 22, verse 5 reminds us that, that is 22, verse 5, from verse 1 to verse 5, that people, when they cried out to God like this, they were saved because they trusted and were not disappointed. Now, the word saved here is malat. Actually means they escaped from death in the Hebrew. They escaped from death. They were not really saved. They were at the point of death, but they escaped from death. Malat. And they were not, although the word here is disappointed, the word in the Hebrew is bush, which means they were not put to shame. Now, what is so shameful about the crucifixion? Ask Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 23. It says, cursed is he who hangs on a tree. Cursed is he who is crucified. So Jesus, by crucifying him, the Jews by crucifying Jesus, they were not only crucifying him, they were putting him to shame because he is cursed by God. They were making a statement. So Jesus, by crying out, he sent us a message that I am going to be saved. by God, and I will not be put to shame. Finally, Luke 24, verse 23 states that the angels told the women that, when they went to look for Jesus at the tomb, that Jesus was alive, not resurrected. The word there is Zoe, alive. Why do you seek the living amongst the dead? And that Jesus was alive. Even Mark, uses a different word, igero. The angel uses the word igero, which means, again, an ambiguous word, risen. He has risen. We are told that the parents of Jesus arose, igero, and they fled with him to Egypt, an ambiguous word. So again, interesting that the choice of words was not resurrection. He didn't die. He was alive, or he arose. So incidentally, the word for resurrection is anastasis. So, if one looks at all the evidence put together, you can only conclude that the evidence, as the Quran says, suggests, proves, in fact, that they did not kill him, they did not crucify him, it only appeared that way, and that those who speak about it, they really don't have the evidence. It is guesswork and preconceived ideas. So as I said, the evidence concludes that the Quran is absolutely spot on. And I think with that, I will close my argument. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bashir. Well, it seems like both of you today are well within your time. So I'm going to set the clock to 10 minutes for Samuel's rebuttal. He'll go first. And Samuel, when you are ready, you are welcome to unmute yourself and to start. And I will start your time as soon as you start to speak.
Okay. Thank you, Bashir, for that presentation. And I'll go through my points now. I was glad to see that you said there was no evidence for a substitution in those verses, and I agree with you. You're saying that Matthew 17:10 says that Jesus could change form. Yes, he did change form in the transfiguration, but they still recognized him. And I guess I'd say that on the cross, he wasn't on the transfiguration. He was as he was, as a man, as a simple man. And so they knew who he was. You then moved on and said from the Quran, chapter 10, verse 94, that if Muslims or if Muhammad or Muslims are in doubt, they should ask the people of the book. And that's a good thing, that the Quran actually tells Muslims to go and speak to the people of the book about what their book says. So I'm going to go through the points you were saying there. So you gave a whole lot of examples of where the Bible, I guess you'd want to say, is contradictory and is not a faithful witness, and therefore we shouldn't accept its witness to Jesus' death on the cross. However, when I look at these, they're really not contradictions at all. And I guess the first big one I want to point out is what you didn't say, and that is you couldn't give any example of where a gospel said Jesus didn't die, Jesus wasn't crucified, and one where it said he was. They all say that, so they're completely unanimous. And so you had to give these other sort of secondary examples, but the big example you need to give is where the Bible says, on the one hand, Jesus didn't die, on the other hand, he did. And so you haven't given that there, so I'll look at these minor ones though. Now, you said, first of all, the color of Jesus' robe is different. Well, I want to say, no, it's not. You said one's purple, one's scarlet. Well, we're going across languages here. And for instance, even in English, there's the color purple, there's the color magenta, and there's the color violet. Now, they're all they're all sort of the same color, aren't they? They're all in that purple range, but we give them different names. And that's just what we've got there. You said, who carried the cross? Was it Jesus or was it Simon from Cyrene? Well, I'd say it's both. That Jesus begins carrying the cross out, but as he's been whipped, he's unable to finish. And so it says they forced Simon to take over and carry the cross after Jesus. So there's no problem there. You pointed out the different hours in which it says that Jesus is crucified. Mark actually gives us 3-hour time marks throughout the whole trial and execution period: 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, and 9 o'clock. John just gives us one. He just gives us that middle time zone. So it may just be that John is giving us a general time to cover everything. But it can also be that John is actually writing in Ephesus, which is where we believe he's writing. And as a result of that, he's using the Roman system of hours rather than the Jewish system of hours, which the Jerusalem church would have used for writing Mark. You spoke about the death of Judas and said how it's different. And because it's different, they can't get their facts straight. It is true that Matthew says that Jesus was hung, that Judas hung himself. But Mark says that he ran into a field and he burst open. Now, I don't even know what running into a field and bursting open means. It may mean that he went in and hung himself and in time burst open for some reason, but I'm not 100% sure I know what it means. So I can't really say they're contradictory. And it may even be that to run and burst open is just a way of talking about a shameful death. And so we can't really say that that's a contradiction. You spoke about the different Gospels and Hebrews saying that Jesus was crucified outside of Jerusalem. Well, that they all actually agree that it was outside of Jerusalem. I wasn't actually sure what your point was there, because they all say it was outside of the city walls. It's at Jerusalem, but it's just outside of the city walls. So I'm not sure what the problem was there. You said that the angel said that Jesus was alive and not resurrected, but when you're resurrected, you are alive, and that's what they're saying. The disciples and the women had witnessed the crucifixion and death of Jesus, and now they come expecting him to be dead, but he's been resurrected. And so the angels say he's alive. That's just what they say. There's no contradiction there. Now, again, you mentioned that they all fled, but then it was helpful. You did come back and say, well, there were people watching. And so you were careful not to say what Ahmad Dadat had said. Ahmad Dadat just said that they fled, when in actual fact, if you read those verses, it says that they were watching and they followed Jesus and they went right into the courtyard where he was tried. I think your point of, just that it's somewhere close, somewhere far away, it doesn't really say that. It's just saying that they were at the cross, that they were standing at a distance watching these things. It doesn't say they're across the valley or something like that. It's just saying they were around him, they were nearby, and that's simply all it's saying. You asked the question, how is it that Pontius Pilate could give the body to Joseph? Well, I think it's just because Joseph is an official. He's part of the Sanhedrin with Nicodemus, and so he's one of the ruling officials. And so he just comes as a minor ruling official to Pontius Pilate, who's the head ruling official. He probably had a relationship with him already, being part of the governing forces, part of the governors within Jerusalem, and so he just saw Pilate and got the body from him. You said that the sign that Jesus gave was the sign of Jonah, and that Jesus said he'd be in the fish for 3 days like Jonah. I just want to say, if you go and read Matthew chapter 12, Jesus never actually mentions the cross there. If you read where he gives the sign of Jonah in Matthew 12, he doesn't talk about the cross. The only way we know he's talking about the cross is when we read elsewhere in the gospel. And for instance, if we read in Matthew chapter 16, he also talks about the sign of Jonah, but then he goes on to talk about this. Let me just read it to you. He says, for a wicked and adulterous generation look for a miraculous sign, but none will be given to it except the sign of Jonah. And then he left them and went away. So in chapter 16, he talks about the sign of Jonah. And then just a little bit further in that chapter, he says, from that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day raised to life. So when Jesus explains what he means by the sign of Jonah, it's that he's going into the grave and he's going to be dead. It's not exactly the same as Jonah. There's some similarities, but there's differences. He never says he's going to be alive like Jonah. He actually, when he explains it, says he's going to die. Now, you spoke about Paul saying that in 1 Corinthians 15, that the resurrection is of a spiritual body. I'm afraid you've misread 1 Corinthians chapter 15, because what Paul says there, and I just encourage you to go read the chapter, what he says is that the physical body we have is corrupted by sin and death. And so it cannot enter into God's kingdom because it is of sin and death. And so God needs to give us a new body, which is the work of the Spirit, and it's a spiritual body. It's a physical body. It's absolutely physical. It's spiritual because it's the work of the Spirit. But Paul is in no way saying that the resurrection is just spiritual. Just go and read it. He's saying there's the physical body, which is corrupted by sin. There'll be the spiritual body, which will be righteous and have everlasting life. It will be the work of the Spirit, but it's still physical. And so that's just what the chapter teaches. And so when you referred to Luke chapter 24 and Jesus eating, yes, Jesus was eating to show his disciples that he wasn't a spirit. They were expecting a spirit. If they saw Jesus, they most likely would have thought he was a ghost because they'd just seen him executed and die. And so because they knew he had just died, if they saw him again, they would say, this is a ghost, this is a spirit. And Jesus said, no, I am physical. I'm not dead. I've been raised. And he proved it by eating. So either way, Christians are people of the resurrection. We do not believe in just a spiritual existence. We believe in a physical body existence. You asked why Jesus quoted Psalm 22. Psalm 22 is actually a psalm of the Messiah. And it's about how the Messiah, David, is rejected by God's people. He's rejected, he suffers, he comes to the verge of death, but then he then is saved and he leads God's people in the true worship of God. And Jesus fulfills this by being the true Messiah who brings the resurrection kingdom of God, something that David could only look forward to. And so David looked forward to the coming of God's kingdom, and he is a model for the Messiah. And Psalm 22 is the model of the suffering before entering his glory of for the Messiah. The Messiah must suffer before entering his glory. And then just to finish up, you were saying that the Qur'an is nice and clear, and that it's Christians who are just guessing. Christians are not guessing. Christians do not have conjecture about this. Christians do not have assumption. For us, there's one message. Jesus Christ died, resurrected. That's the gospel message. It always has been. As I pointed out, there are at least nine different versions of what happened from Muslims, and the conjecture is actually with Islam. The conjecture is not with Christianity. And as I said, I'd like to hear what you believe, because if you don't tell me, then that's just part of Muslims not knowing. Finish there? Thank you.
Thanks, Samuel. We went a little bit over time, but that's fine. I will afford the same time to Bashir as well. In his rebuttal, Bashir, you can unmute your mic, and then you are welcome to start with your 10-minute rebuttal.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. That's perfect. Let me know when you start, and I will start your time.
Right. Okay, ready. All right. Samuel, I spoke about a court of law. Now, a court of law is not going to accept things like, well, perhaps they were colorblind, perhaps it was magenta, and, that sort of thing. Things like it may mean a field. I don't know what happened. Perhaps he hanged himself and then he fell on a farm. Look, in a court of law, we're going to have to be much more precise than that. So you're going to have the exact location, the exact time. So I don't accept this idea, and the Quran does not accept this idea that you can be vague about details, especially the most important event in the history of the universe, and you're telling me things like, well, perhaps It could have been that, A, or perhaps it could have been B. I think we have to be much more precise than that. You spoke about the idea that that everybody is convinced that the crucifixion took place and that Jesus prophesied it. But that is, again, not what the Bible is telling me. Firstly, if you look at John chapter 20, verse 9, we are told very clearly that the disciples did not know that Jesus must rise from the dead. So, we have a real problem. On the road to Emmaus, Luke chapter 24, Jesus, appearing in disguise, talks with some of his disciples, and they say, well, look, they've crucified a great prophet, not God who died for our sins, and, they didn't know that he must rise from the dead. John chapter 18, verse 20, Jesus tells us that I spoke openly to the world. I've always taught in the temples and in the synagogues where all the Jews gather. Nothing have I taught in secret. Yet, at every place where Jesus speaks about his crucifixion and resurrection, it says, he told the disciples aside. But Jesus says, look, I spoke openly to the world. So everybody had to know, everyone had to know he had to die and he had to be resurrected. And yet John chapter 20, verse 9 makes it very clear that nobody knew. The disciples, if his disciples didn't know, nobody knew. So we have a real problem. You said, look, historically speaking, it is beyond reasonable doubt. You quoted Tacitus. No, it isn't beyond reasonable doubt. Philo was a contemporary of Jesus. And, Philo doesn't even mention Jesus at all. You don't think that's shocking? All the other historians, yes, they may mention Jesus in passing, but, Tacitus, for example, tells us in his book of histories, book 5, chapter 8 to 10, he says, he describes, the reign of Tiberius, and he concludes with the words, and all was quiet during the reign of Tiberius. And we know Jesus, he moved around during the reign of Tiberius. Luke, who's also a historian, Luke chapter 3, verse 1 tells us that, during the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius. So if Tacitus tells us that all was quiet, can we really believe that, earthquakes took place, people were raised from the dead, walked into the town, there was a solar eclipse for the first time in history. Solar eclipse cannot happen during a full moon, but it happened, and all was quiet during the reign of Tiberius. That must be the understatement of the year. So no, Tacitus, people like Tacitus simply, they heard from Christians that, Jesus was crucified, and they said it. Again, nothing remarkable. The famous case of Marie Antoinette, and this was in my history book. The peasants were crying, we want bread. And she said, give them cake. And we know now from very specialized historians that she never said such a thing. There is no historical proof, but, it is in the history books. So, when Tacitus and others simply report that, well, look, there was a person like Jesus and he died, they are simply assuming facts not yet in evidence. And, well, Christians say that, who cares? But surely, if they truly felt that Jesus was crucified, then it was more important to mention that, zombies walking through the streets. People get offended when I say that. It simply means the living dead walking through the streets, earthquakes, solar eclipses, never before in the history of science. But they don't. They simply mention the crucifixion. What does that tell you? Samuel spoke about taking the souls at night. The Quran speaks about that, yes. But the Quran is talking about two different concepts. The one is that that God takes your soul when you die. The other concept is that whenever a person sleeps, it is like a little death, and God keeps your soul safely, and if he wishes, he will return your soul to you. And if he does not, if God keeps your soul, you will be dead permanently. Simple as that. Samuel spoke about martyrdom. Yes, the Quran speaks about martyrdom, but again, let us not conflate two different concepts. For example, if I were to say, the king is dead, long live the king. What am I saying? People intuitively understand what I'm saying. Firstly, the king is dead. That is a historical fact. Long live the king. That is more in terms of, the legacy of the king. So, when the Quran speaks about martyrdom, the Quran is not confused. The Quran is very clear that, look, those who fought and died in the cause of God, yes, they are physically dead, but spiritually they are alive. Unlike other people who would die physically as well as spiritually till the day of judgment. So there is no confusion there. Let's see. Oh, yes. Samuel spoke about the resurrection. I would like to reserve that for our interaction, because I think we need to look at that passage very carefully. 1 Corinthians chapter 15. I don't think that he has made any other important points with consideration. Again, oh yes, as regards the words alive, I think it is significant, because if he was resurrected, it is astonishing that the word resurrection is mentioned really only once by Jesus. When he speaks to Martha, I think the sister of Lazarus, he says, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me will live forever. So obviously he meant it in a spiritual sense. He didn't mean it in a physical sense, because, Martha believed in him and she's not alive, is she? So he meant it in a spiritual sense, that you listen to my words, I've received revelation from God, and you will then receive eternal life. So the word resurrection or anastasis is mentioned only once by Jesus, and that in a spiritual sense. Even the word crucifixion is mentioned in a spiritual sense by Paul. Galatians chapter 2, verse 20. I was crucified through Christ, not physically, spiritually. Even returning from the dead can be a spiritual event. Hebrews chapter 11, we are told that Abraham sacrificed Isaac. We say Ishmael, but let us stick with Isaac. And we are told that because Abraham received Isaac back from the dead, so to speak, although he didn't really sacrifice him, but because he received him back figuratively, one can say that Isaac came back from the dead. So the whole event by Jesus can simply be a spiritual experience. Samuel wanted to know, what do I believe? I believe what the Quran says. They did not kill him. They did not crucify him. My mandate ends there and exactly there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bashir. That was good time management again on your side. Let me just start and say that for the cross-examination, we're going to give each speaker 10 minutes to ask questions to the other speaker. Bashir will go first, posing questions to Samuel, and then for 10 minutes, Samuel will pose questions to Bashir. Just a little note, I mentioned to the speakers that, when they answer, to look to answer the question under 2 minutes. Otherwise, you can take all 10 minutes and just answer one question. So just keep that in mind when you are asked a question. And then the one that is questioning will obviously espouse and ask more questions on the topic that he has discussed, or he can do and use his time as he is seeing fit. But Bashir, I'm going to give you 10 minutes, and as soon as you start asking your questions to Samuel, your 10 minutes will start for your cross-examination. You can unmute yourself, Samuel. You can go, Bashir, as soon as you start. I will start your time.
Great. Can you hear me?
I can
Yes.
hear you.
Good. Samuel, you mentioned 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And you
Yes.
said, well, it's not, you are not giving me the interpretation that I demand. So let us look at this passage very clearly.
Yes.
1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 35. But someone may ask, how are the dead raised? With what kind of body will they come? So it's very specific. And then 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 42 answers the question. It says, and so it is with the resurrection of the dead, right? It is raised imperishably, it is sown in dishonor, and it carries on. And it says, it dies a natural body, and it is raised a spiritual body. So it is being very, very precise. I'm not sure how you can give it any other rendering.
Okay.
How would you explain that?
Sure. Well, you began at verse 35. I would continue. He says, what you sow, you do not plant, the body that will be, right? The body that will be, just a seed, perhaps of wheat or something else. But God gives it a body as he has determined. And to each kind of seed, he gives its own body. And so he talks about the body and flesh. All flesh is not the same. Men have one kind of flesh, animals another, birds another, and fish another. There are also heavenly bodies and earthly bodies. But the splendor of the heavenly bodies is of a kind, and the splendor of the earthly bodies is of another kind. So he's talking about the body and the flesh, like he says it. And then in verse 42, he says, so it will be at the resurrection of the dead. I mean, it's the resurrection, which was understood at that time as a physical body. The body that is sown is perishable, but it's raised imperishable. It's sown in dishonor, it's raised in glory. I mean, if it's just spiritual, then it's not raised. I mean, it only makes sense if he's talking about a physical body. It's sown in weakness, it's raised in power. It is sown a natural body, it's raised a spiritual body. But it's a body. Like even the spiritual, it's a spiritual body. I don't know what else to say, but just to invite people to read chapter 15, verses 35 to 44. Yes, sorry.
Sure. It is a body in terms of length, breadth, and width. You are recognizable, but the word there is pneuma. You see, it is very specific. It is very, very specific. But yes, all right. We'll go on to our next question, and I think people can read it and decide for themselves. I think you would have to go very far to give it an alternative interpretation. All right. We are all agreed that for Christians, the crucifixion and resurrection, most important event. Yet how is it possible that the disciples didn't know that Jesus was going to rise from the dead? John 20 verse 9 confirms that. Could you, and we are told in the Bible very specifically that Jesus told them.
Yes.
He told everyone. He told everyone. John chapter 18 verse 20. He spoke openly to the world, and yet nobody seems to be aware of it. Can you give us an explanation?
Yes. And you're absolutely right. That is one of the themes in the Gospels, that the disciples, they love Jesus. They're amazed at what he does, and they're happy with much of his teaching. But when he talks about his own death and resurrection, they say, no, you can't die, right? That doesn't fit into their way of thinking about the Messiah. Their idea was that the Messiah would come and defeat the Romans and be, a conquering king. But what we actually find is that when the Messiah is to come, he has a different role. His role is to defeat sin, to defeat the devil, and to defeat death. Because the Messiah who's coming, as we read about in Isaiah 9 and other places, is bringing God's everlasting resurrection kingdom. And so the the disciples just don't understand how God's going to fulfill his plans and purposes. They think God's going to send someone to defeat the Romans, but what God is doing is he's sending someone to defeat sin, the devil, and death. And so they don't understand who Jesus is. Jesus says to them, you don't understand the scriptures. And this is his complaint about his disciples, that he's saying to them, even though this is in the scriptures, you don't believe it. And that's one of his complaints against them. So he did speak openly, and I'm going to ask you about that as well. But the reason they didn't believe was they didn't know the scriptures, and it didn't fit into what they were wanting God to do. And I guess that's one of the things, that we may want God to do something ourselves. We may say, God, you should do this. And that's what they're doing to Jesus. They're saying, God, you should do this. In fact, we see that in Matthew 16, where Peter says to Jesus, you will not die. And Jesus says, you've got the things of man rather than the things of God, the thoughts of man rather than the thoughts of God. I'll finish there, though.
You see, understanding and knowing are two different things. They didn't know he was going to rise from the dead. And I find that astonishing, because this is a man that they saw raising the dead, walking on water, doing transfiguring, and they found it difficult to believe that he could die and raise himself from the dead again. They couldn't understand it. They didn't even know it. I'm sorry, your explanation isn't good enough, but all right. Could I ask the third question?
Yes, of course.
Yes. Sign of Jonah. I think the sign of Jonah is very clear. Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the whale. So will I be. It's Jesus being very specific. He's saying this is the only sign that I will give. If it is the only sign, then I think we need to look at that sign in all its glory. So I'm not sure why you are giving it, you are ignoring the simple, straightforward context of the sign.
Sure, okay. First of all, if we actually go and read Jonah, what does Jonah say when he's inside the fish? This is what he says. He says, in my distress, I called to the Lord, and he answered me. From the depths of the grave, I called for help. So Jonah's not saying that he's alive and happy, right? So Jonah never says, I'm alive. He says, I'm in the grave, right? Jonah always says, I am in the grave. And we have to let Jesus explain what he means by the sign of Jonah. And as I pointed out in my presentation, Jesus speaks about the sign of Jonah twice. The first time he speaks about it in chapter 12 of Matthew, he just says, I'll be like the sign of Jonah. And he doesn't even mention the cross. So the only way we know Jesus is even talking about the cross in chapter 12 of Matthew, when he talks about the sign of Jonah, is because we read elsewhere in the gospel. But when we read elsewhere in the gospel, in Matthew 16, where he talks about it again, he talks about it and then goes on to talk about his death, and that he's going to be dead 3 days. And so we have to let Jesus explain what he means. For instance, Jonah ran away from God when God called him to do something. Jesus didn't run away. Okay, so you just can't make every parallel between Jesus and Jonah. You have to let Jesus explain what he means by Jonah. And in the end, we have to let Jesus explain what he means. And as I said, he talks about the sign of Jonah in Matthew 16, and then goes straight on to talk about dying for 3 days, which is that Jonah idea. And he talks about dying and being raised again. So I have to let the Bible explain itself. And I think that's really the best way to interpret any book. It's what I tried to do with the Qur'an, to let the Qur'an interpret itself. I want to let the Bible interpret itself. And, when Jesus talks about the sign of Jonah in Matthew 12, he doesn't say, I will be alive like Jonah. That's what people read into it. He's just saying, I'll be 3 days and 3 nights like Jonah. He doesn't talk about being alive or dead.
Again, I'm letting the Bible speak for itself. I'm not talking about every parallel. I'm simply paraphrasing. Jesus said, he was very specific. As Jonah was in the belly of the whale, so will I be. Now, Psalms 116 talks about Sheol, where Jonah was. It simply means a place of great distress. Doesn't mean you're dead. It can mean a place of great distress. So Jesus was in distress. Jonah was in distress. Jesus prayed. Jonah prayed for 3 days, 3 nights. It's very, very specific. Okay, I think.
Well, guys, thank you very much. You were pretty much on cue, and you made my task a lot easier. Now we're going to turn it around. Samuel, you've got 10 minutes to ask Bashir questions. Bashir, you've got an hour. I'm just teasing. You've got 10 minutes as well.
Okay, hang on. Let me just get this set up here. Now, let me get this here. Now, throughout the Gospels, we find Jesus saying things like this, and this is from Matthew 16:21. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. Now, Jesus says these things very clearly. I mean, how do you understand then those types of statements in the gospel?
I don't, and that is the problem, because Jesus said it very clearly. He says he spoke to everyone, and yet everyone is shocked, including his own disciples. John chapter 20, verse 9, they did not know that he must rise from the dead. When Jesus meets his disciples, they are shocked that Jesus was crucified, on the road to Emmaus. And they don't even recognize Jesus. He was probably in disguise because he survived the crucifixion. So he was in disguise. And I think it's a real problem for me, as well as especially for Christians, because Jesus apparently makes these very clear references and nobody seems to know about it. So I think it is a problem for Christians rather than for Muslims.
Okay.
How do you explain
as I pointed out, it's not a problem for Christians because we see that the disciples just have an expectation of a Messiah who's going to conquer the Romans, not bring about not conquer sin, the devil, and death. So it's because they don't know God's plan that they don't really believe what he's saying. But whether or not they believe it, Jesus is saying it. That's my point. They may not believe it. Okay, they may not believe it. People don't believe Jesus' words today. My point is, Jesus
it's not a question of
says
belief.
these things.
Sorry, Samuel, it's not a question of belief. It's a question of knowledge. They did not know he was going to die. You see, they may not have been. You see, if the argument was they knew he was going to die, but they didn't believe it, that's one thing. But they didn't know. They had no idea. They had no knowledge of it. Forget about belief. A knowledge first and then belief. No knowledge, no belief.
Okay. Amazing. Well, my point is, I'll move on, but my point is simply that Jesus said these things very clearly. Whether or not people believed him or understood them, my point is he said them clearly. I want to move on to the subject of historians. Yes. Now, you were saying, Tacitus says there was peace in the empire and all that, but that's not what modern historians solely base themselves on. That they look at a whole range of testimony, and it is beyond reasonable doubt that Jesus died. So you're not going to get people like Bart Ehrman or any of the historians that I mentioned. E.P. Sanders or McCrossan. I've forgotten his first name. You're not going to get any of these historians. Some of them aren't historians. They're more biblical scholars, but they all take the view, and all historians and the historical dictionaries, Cambridge University, Oxford University, they all say that Jesus was crucified and died. So how is it that you deal with that? How is it that you deal with this complete consensus, total consensus by historians that Jesus, even by some Islamic historians, as I pointed out? I even had Professor Masoud Al-Hassad who takes that view. So what is it that you do with that?
Well, I think I pointed out Marie Antoinette. People simply accepted the fact that she said such a thing when she didn't. Now, why would they accept it? Simply because in the big scheme of things, it's an irrelevant idea for them. So people like Bart Ehrman, other historians, would simply repeat that Jesus was crucified simply because the whole incident is irrelevant. So they are quite happy listening to hearsay. However, for somebody who, like me, who has a purpose, who has studied, because of what the Quran says, I have studied, I took the liberty of studying the text. I pointed out the contradictions, the flaws. I cannot simply accept it simply because of what the Quran says. And I have studied it and I presented my findings. Now, I don't think Bart Ehrman or anyone else took the liberty or the trouble to really examine it simply because, well, it's in the whole scheme of things for them, it is really an irrelevant issue.
Well, I just want to push back there, because if you take someone like Bart Ehrman, he absolutely studies things in details and he relishes in dismissing the Bible. So Bart Ehrman is actually happy to dismiss the Bible as much as possible. You know, in his book, Jesus Interrupted, he's more than happy to dismiss the Bible as much as possible. But when it comes to the death of Jesus, he says, no, that's beyond reasonable doubt.
Well, I'm not too sure what his evidence is for that. Perhaps I have to talk about Ehrman sometime.
Okay. Now, I just wanted to ask, as we finish up, you're saying that you just believe what the Quran says, but as I pointed out, I showed 9 different Islamic views. I'm not actually convinced that, like, what does the Quran actually say? What do you say is the explanation? Because you just can't say, I just believe it, because I showed 9 different views. Like, what is your view as to what actually happened?
Well, I mentioned the Quran, chapter 10, which asks me not to simply believe it, to blindly believe it, but to consult the sources, the original sources, which is what I did. The Bible, the earliest record of the crucifixion. And what it tells me is what the Quran tells me. They did not kill him, they did not crucify him, and that the evidence is very weak for that kind of thinking. It is contradictory, and it doesn't make sense. I think it is.
Okay, now hang on. Now, well, I want to say it's not obvious. Now, you've just said, like, I've asked you what you believe the crucifixion account of the Quran, what happened, and your answer was that the Quran says. Hang on, I'm asking the question. That the answer you gave me was that the Quran says to ask Christians, and you said when you ask Christians and read the Quran, and read the Bible, it agrees with the Quran. Well, I've showed you that it doesn't. That the examples you gave, I've answered. And secondly, you didn't give any example where one gospel says Jesus didn't die and one gospel says he did. So it's complete unanimous. It's complete and utter consensus. And you just, I don't know, you just haven't answered it yet. What do you believe happened? What happened according to the Quran? What happened?
There is a difference between belief and knowledge. And knowledge and evidence. People may believe what they like. I'm simply putting forward my view or the Quranic view based on the evidence, not on belief. People may believe what they like, but on evidence, the Bible would agree with the Quran that there are a great deal of discrepancies, and you can choose to ignore those discrepancies and believe, or you can look at the evidence and say, look, we have a real problem here. What do we do about it? And Christians simply are prepared to ignore it. And that, again, that's their right, that's their belief, but I can't based on the evidence. And that's what the Quran says,
Yeah. Well, I want to say, in my reply, I answered what you call discrepancies, but I keep coming back to this point. You could not give a discrepancy of one gospel saying Jesus didn't die and one gospel saying he did. It's unanimous, and I still don't know what you believe. I still don't know what you believe. Which one of the 9 views do you take? Do you have a different
gospel? No gospel says that Jesus died. it's very clear that the disciples did not even know that Jesus was going to die. It's very clear. And yet here is Jesus walking around telling everybody within earshot, listen guys, I'm going to be crucified and I'm going to die. Nobody knows about it. And you don't find that strange? You don't find it strange that the disciples of Jesus didn't know he was going to die?
Yes, I've explained that they're expecting a conquering
explanation
Messiah.
is not proof. Explanation is not proof. That's my point. It's quite clear they didn't know. And you don't find that.
But all of the Gospels say Jesus gave up his spirit. That they all say Jesus died.
What does that mean? Jesus gave up his spirit. What does that mean?
Well, it means to expire. It means to expire, to die. That's what, like, when you give up your spirit, it means you die. They all say that.
They assume that. Yes. All right.
Okay, thanks, guys. That's it.
Okay.
Thank you for a lively discussion, and thank you for a lively question and answering session. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to give each speaker 3 minutes just to give their closing statements. And we're going to start with Bashir, and then Samuel, you've got 3 minutes. Samuel, I'm going to mute you. And Bashir, as soon as you start, I will start your time. When you start to talk, I'll start your time.
Great. All right. Look, first, thanks, Rudolph, and thank you to Samuel. Wonderful discussion. We should have perhaps more discussions like this. I hope the listeners, the audience enjoyed it. I hope we made them think. I would just ask them to mull over the evidence again, look at the contradictions. They should ask themselves, would a court of law accept all those contradictions? A believer may, but a court of law, a judge, who is perhaps not a believer, would he or she accept the evidence? I think not. Samuel said things like, well, the Gospels tell us that Jesus was crucified outside Jerusalem, yet Christians today, they go to the Holy Church of Sepulchre, where, it was the place of crucifixion, and, he doesn't see a contradiction there. He doesn't see a contradiction when it comes to Jesus telling everyone within earshot that he was going to be crucified and resurrected. And yet nobody seems to be aware of this amazing event, the most amazing event since the creation of the universe. And he sees no contradiction there. Christians see no contradiction. I really think that Christians need to revisit the text again. 1 Corinthians 15, I think, is significant, where Paul tells us that and he names the spiritual body that is going to be resurrected. He calls it a pneuma. There is a different name for a material body, and Jesus says very clearly that he is not a pneuma, he is not a spiritual being, therefore he is not resurrected. And I think that is significant. He points to his hands and his feet. I think Jesus is very specific about the sign of Jonah. He says, as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the whale, so will I be in the heart of the earth. Jonah was alive, he will be alive. He is very specific about it. He is not talking about any other parallels. You see, he's not talking about him going to the Jews and the Jews rejecting him, Jonah going to people who initially rejected him and so forth, and then we accepted him afterwards. Although one can draw parallels between Jonah and Jesus, even in that, but leaving that aside, Jesus is very clear on what one should concentrate on. And I think when Christians read it, one should focus on that. So I think with that, I just want all of you to go, perhaps listen to what I had to say, consult the evidence, And hopefully you will come to the same conclusion that the Quran has. They did not kill him, nor did they crucify him. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Bashir. You took about 20 seconds extra, so I'm going to forward Samuel at the same time. Samuel, over to you. You can unmute yourself, and you are welcome to start with your 3-minute closing.
Okay, well, I want to thank you, Bashir, for tonight. It's not always easy for us to be able to talk about things that are very important to us, but we need to do that. We need to keep talking, and God willing, for everyone who was listening tonight, that this has helped you to think through some issues, to hear the other side, and hopefully to be a little wiser in this regard. And again, I want to thank Rudolph for organising this. So the question tonight was Jesus crucified? And my answer was yes, and there's no reason to doubt about this. We've seen that the Quran's description of the crucifixion makes most sense when we think about it as the description of a martyr. We saw that the way that it talks about the fact that, there is no verse in the Quran that says Jesus did not die, Jesus was not crucified. It's denying the Jews crucified or killed him. And this is what we saw was the case when it denied the jihadists from them killing Muhammad's enemies. And so we saw that the Quran's description of a martyr as only appearing to be dead was also how the crucifixion is described, and how when it talks about Jesus being raised up, that's what happens to martyrs. They are raised up and they are in paradise with Allah now. And so I was saying that the Quran is describing the unseen realities. It's not denying the historical facts. And I believe that makes better sense when we let the Quran interpret itself. We've seen that the gospel is perfectly clear when it comes to the crucifixion of Jesus and that he died. It's not vague at all. It doesn't have contradictions. The contradictions that were pointed out as a way of trying to throw doubt over the crucifixion have all been answered. They're not contradictions. They're the normal types of differences you would get from eyewitness accounts. And so the gospel is clear that Jesus was crucified and died. We've also seen that historians accept the crucifixion and death of Jesus as beyond reasonable doubt. And so there's no reason to not accept this as well. As I said, it's actually an area that I think Christians and Muslims can agree on. We may disagree about some things, but I believe this is an area that we can agree ourselves. Finally, I'd just like to say, if you've never read a gospel for yourself, why don't you get a copy of the Bible, or Matthew is a small section of the Bible, one of the gospel accounts, and just read it and make up your own mind. Find out, who is this man Jesus? What was he about? Did he die on the cross? Because the gospel makes this very clear, and you can consider the evidence yourself. Because if Jesus did die on the cross for our sins and God has saved us, that is something we need to know about. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Samuel. Thank you, Bashir. It was a good discussion. And again, for the listeners that are out there, if you need any more info from each respective speaker, you can go for Bashir to islamicinfo.co.za, islamicinfo, that is one word, .co.za. And if you want to engage with some of the things that Samuel has written, some of the resources that he has on his site, you can go to engagingwithislam.org. That is one word, engagingwithislam.org. And you can access a lot of other material that they've written and a lot of other topics that they've debated as well. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Thank you so much, Bashir. It was really good, and maybe we'll do it again. I think now that we've brought the Aussie in, I think now the game is on. We don't have anybody in New Zealand, so unfortunately we can't make it a tri-nation. It will be good to do. I see Bashir is sitting with his Australian jersey on. Well, there is no, unfortunately, there's no kangaroo on, so I wasn't too sure if he's flying the Aussie colours today. But it was good to have all of you here, and it was good to have this discussion. Thank you, guys, and I'll speak with you again.